In this Sikha, the Rebbe is going to be discussing Rashi's comment, Rashi's explanation on the word luchos. Now, the word luchos, the way you would have thought it should be spelled usually, is with two vavs, lamed vav, ches vav sof, and that would mean two luchos. However, a number of times in our parsha, it says luchos without either both vavs or definitely without the second vav, which it could be read as luchas, which then would mean one luach, one tablet. And Rashi comments and says the reason why it says it this way is because, in fact, the two luchos were like one. In other words, they were very similar to each other in the sense of their size, their shape, etc. They were very similar. They were equal to each other. Now, Rashi doesn't actually say which time he's referring to when he's explaining the word luchos, and we don't have psukim numbers. Rashi didn't write with psukim numbers, but we could see where Rashi placed this pirush, which would be coming definitely after pasuk tes in this particular section and before pasuk yudches. Now, the truth of the matter is, Rashi had explained this once before already in Parshas Kisiso. Why is he saying it now a second time? Is because many parshas and even chumashim passed from when Rashi explained it the previous time, as Rashi will sometimes do. The question, however, is why doesn't Rashi explain this on an earlier pasuk, as pasuk tes, where there also we have the word luchos. It says it twice, and it's also saying without that vav. So the question is, why doesn't Rashi say it earlier? The truth of the matter is, if Rashi has to explain it again after such a long interruption, we had this word spelled this way already in Parshas Voeschan, and why doesn't Rashi say anything there? Going back to Parshas Kisiso, we could also ask the same question. There too, it's not the first time the Torah is spelling luchos without the vav, spelling it as luchas. It's already in Parshas Mishpatim earlier. Why didn't Rashi explain it there? Now, the simple answer we could give is based on what's known. Rashi usually does not come to explain why words are spelled without certain letters or with those letters. He will only explain it if it's a certain difficulty in Pshutei Shel Mikra. So we might say that in our case, one of the psukim that have luchos without the vav is pasuk Yud Aleph, and in this pasuk you have luchos twice. Once with a vav, once without a vav. So you might say, this is something that would bother the Ben Chamish Lemikra. In the same pasuk, it's being spelled differently, and that's why he's explaining it. The problem, however, with this is, says that number one, in Parshas Kisisa, which is the first time Rashi does explain it twice, that it says that when it says luchos without a vav, in that pasuk it also says twice luchos, but both of them are written exactly the same without a vav, and yet Rashi explains it. Although the Torah is not changing from one to the other within the same pasuk. Point number two says that even if that's going to help us understand why Rashi finds a need to explain this, the question is still going to be a question just moved back to the pasuk. Why is the pasuk hinting this only in the later time when it's mentioned luchos, and not the first time when luchos is also mentioned twice in pasuk tes, for example, in our parsha, and there the Torah could have hinted to this by saying one time with a vav and one time without a vav. In order to explain this, the Rebbe is going to look at a very interesting difference that we find in Rashi when he explains words that are missing letters. Sometimes Rashi will say that this word is written chaser, it's missing a letter, missing a vav, for example. Sometimes, like in our case, Rashi does not say it's missing anything. Rashi just says luchas ksiv, that it says it's to be read as luchas, which tells us that they're both equal. In other words, Rashi is not saying there's anything missing, he's just telling us how we're going to read it now in the way it seems. So why is it that sometimes Rashi points out that it's chaser, that it's missing, and sometimes Rashi just gives us the explanation without telling us that it's chaser? In order to understand this, says the Rebbe, we're first going to have a look again at this rule we said before. The Rashi usually doesn't explain why words are missing letters unless there's a difficulty in Pshutei Shel Mikra. But the truth of the matter is that this rule only applies when there's no difficulty within the word itself, within that context of the pasuk. In other words, if because of the content of the pasuk and the context of the pasuk, it would have been more suitable, more fitting for this word to be written with all of its letters, then Rashi will explain why the letter is not there. So some examples. The first time Rashi explains this a letter missing, is right away in Sheishis Yimei Bereshis. The pasuk says, "Yehi ma'oros b'rekiya hashamayim." There should be luminaries in the heavens. Rashi says, "Chaser vav." It's written without a vav. Why? Because this day of the week is a day of me'era, of curses. So ma'oros without a vav can be understood as a curse. There's certain curses associated with that day. What's bothering Rashi here? Because these psukim are speaking about the creation of the world. Hashem created a perfect world. We're trying to say the greatness of these things. And especially here, the luminary, such an amazing thing. The psukim all finish off with Vayara Lakim Ki Tov, how great and beautiful creation is. And yet, speaking about the Ma'oros, which should have, you would think, be written full, indicating the full light of the luminaries and the greatness of it, a perfection, and yet it's written missing a letter, indicating there's something lacking here. That's what's bothering Rashi. Moving on to Parshas Noach after the Mabul. It says Hashem smelled a beautiful aroma from the Karbonos. Hashem says to himself, I'm not going to curse the land anymore because of man. And then it gives a reason. Ki Adam ram min urav, because a person's Yetzer Hara is bad, min urav from his youth, so I'm not going to strike him again. On the word min urav, Rashi says, min urav ksiv. It says min urav. Rashi doesn't say the word, it's missing a vav, but that's what Rashi's explaining. That it says min urav, which could also mean shaken out. From the moment the baby is shaken out of its mother's womb, that's already when he has the Yetzer Hara. Here again we have a question why the vav is missing. What's bothering Rashi? Because if the point the pasuk is trying to say that it's not the person's fault that he's acting this way because he has the Yetzer Hara already from his youth, by taking out a letter from the word menu'urav, which means his youth, it sounds like we're trying to diminish somewhat from the meaning of the word menu'urav. In other words, not actually from his youth, maybe a bit older, but that's the opposite seemingly of what the pasuk is trying to say. We're trying to say that it's not his fault. So why would the word menu'urav not be emphasized fully? So Rashi needs to explain why the vav is missing. In Parshas Chayesara, Avram comes to want to buy the Ma'aras HaMachpelah. It says, Ve'Ephron Yoshev, Ephron is sitting there amongst his people. Rashi says, the word Yoshev is written chaser. It's again missing a vav. To tell us that only that day he was appointed as a judge. Here again we have the question. If the psukim are trying to bring out the greatness of Ephron, he's agreeing to sell the Ma'aras HaMachpelah, why are we diminishing it somehow by taking away some of the letters? Based on all of this, says the Rebbe, we'll now also be able to understand why Rashi sometimes uses the word chaser and sometimes not. And that is, when we have a word that's missing a letter, now what's Rashi going to tell us about why the word is missing a letter? In some cases, the meaning of the missing letter is actually going to be to indicate that yes, there is something lacking here. It's there's some deficiency here. And then Rashi is going to say the word chaser. On the other hand, if the word that's missing a letter is not coming to tell us that there was a deficiency over here. It's coming to teach us something else, that the word should be read differently because it's going to come teach us something. Or perhaps even to emphasize and to strengthen the word that we're saying. Then Rashi doesn't say chaser. Rashi just tells us the word, how it would be read now. Going back to the examples. In Yehimu Oiros, to be the luminaries, which seemingly should have been a full word, Rashi says the word chaser because in fact he's explaining to us there is something lacking. There's a deficiency over here. Oiros also has the implication of a curse. When it says Ve'Ephron Yoshev, again, seemingly it should have had all the letters. Rashi says chaser to tell us that it was only that day that he was appointed in honor of Avram. That means he on his own really wasn't deserving to be the judge. He was never the judge till now. We're trying to emphasize it's only in honor of Avram, but really there's a deficiency in his Yoshev. He wasn't really the judge there all the time. But now let's look at the pasuk about Yetzer Lev Adam Ram and Urav that says after the Mabul, where we said Rashi does not say the word chaser, he just says it's to be read mina'ara, which means from when the baby is shaken out of its womb. And we asked, seemingly, the pasuk should have been saying more mina'ara, in other words, to emphasize it's from his youth, not from sometime older. So Rashi says it's to be read mina'ara, meaning there's nothing missing. In other words, we're not emphasizing the deficiency, just the opposite. It's actually coming to highlight the limud zchus, what we're trying to say positive about the person, that is totally not his fault, because it's actually from even a younger age. So the word menarav is not lacking, missing, the vav is not there, but Rashi doesn't say the word chaser. He's telling us we're going to read the word as if it's telling us something that's actually strengthening the limud zchus on this person while he's doing averis. Now let's go back to the idea of luchos, why Rashi does not explain the luchos in Parshas Va'eschanan, only in Parshas Ekev. So too, he doesn't explain it in Parshas Kisisa and only in Parshas, he explains it in Parshas Kisisa, not in the earlier one, Parshas Mishpatim. When does Rashi bothered by the fact that Luchos is missing the Vav? It's when the psukim are speaking about the greatness of the luchos, not just speaking about that Hashem gave that Hashem wrote down the Aseres HaDibros on the luchos. It's specifically in there in Parshas Kisisa, as well as in our parsha, in Parshas Ekev, where the Torah is speaking about the greatness of the luchos. For example, in our parsha, we're trying to see how great the luchos were, and yet the Yidden sinned, and Moshe Rabbeinu had to break the luchos. It's specifically in these places where we're speaking about the greatness of the luchos. Seemingly, the word luchos should have been written with the vavs to emphasize the greatness of the luchos. So Rashi says luchas ksiv. It doesn't say the word there's anything missing a vav, because we're not coming to say a deficiency in the luchos. The reason why it says luchos is actually to come bring out something greater about the luchos, that they're both equal. How is that showing something even greater about the luchos? Says the Rebbe, when two stones are made, two tablets are made, if it would be man-made, it's impossible to get them exactly the same size. That's even to start with. Especially in our case, says the Rebbe. We have the two luchos. On the first one, we have 5 of the dibros with many, many more words in psukim. Many more letters on it. The second luach has many less words. And yet, although the letters are exactly the same size, the spacing between the letters on the words and the dibros are exactly the same size, and somehow in a miraculous way, they're still both exactly the same size. This is, in other words, coming to bring out, again, a maila, greatness about the luchos. So it's not a chisaron. Rashi says, luchas ksiv, it's written as one luach. And that would obviously also highlight the tragedy of the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu had to break the luchos as a result of the Chet HaEgel. So now going back in our parsha itself, why Rashi didn't bring it in the earlier pasuk, in pasuk Tes, because there it was mainly speaking about how the luchos are still by Hashem. Rashi is really bothered by the part of when it's speaking about how the luchos come down to us, when Moshe Rabbeinu is bringing down the luchos. This is where we're really trying to emphasize that it's still in its godly state, such a miraculous luchos. And yet, this is what had to happen as a result of the Chet HaEgel, and that's why the Torah specifically emphasizes it, and Rashi brings this specifically over here after Moshe Rabbeinu is already bringing down the luchos. Says the Rebbe, this will also explain one more point, why in our psukim, we have the pasuk uses the word luchos ha'avonim and luchos habris, and it's interesting, luchos ha'avonim, that's where it says without the vav, luchas ha'avonim, by luchos habris, it says with the vav. You would think, if anything, it should be the opposite. Luchas Abris is speaking about our bond with the Eibishter, our covenant with the Eibishter. Luchas Avonim is speaking about the stone. Why is it in Luchas Avonim, that's where it's missing the vav to say that it's something so godly? So the Rebbe explains, because the main chiddush, the main idea is to show that it's not only on the spiritual level or on a more high level where the luchos are so spiritual and godly, but even as they come down into the stone and being brought down to the Yidden, this is where they remain completely spiritual and godly, and in that way bringing out the maila of the luchos even as they're down here.